Hello everyone and welcome back to another history lecture. I am finally back in California, and I think after spending the summer in New York, it definitely feels like a breath of fresh air, both literally and mentally. And I'd like to think that I spent my summer very fruitfully, and I was very satisfied by the end of it in terms of meeting people, experience, and I think really putting myself in positions to learn and think through things. And I think one of the bigger takeaways I had from having this temporary coastal shift in my life is I think I really value living in California in terms of bikeable cities and living in a city and community and urban space that allows you to sustain yourself and prioritizes that. But one big thing that I do really miss about New York is its sheer abundance of art and institutions to go see and museums and endless amount of spaces, which I do feel like San Francisco does sorely lack and lose on that part. Because just in terms of, I think, creative endeavor and finding creative art spaces, San Francisco definitely has a lack of density and accessibility to that. But I love New York because literally every day, if I had free time, I would try to spend it going to an institution that I have always meant to see. And I didn't even get around to seeing all of them, partially because I was working basically full time, but in New York, every passing day, I had a new institution or a museum or a gallery space that I wanted to see that I had never seen before previously because there's just so many. And despite I feel like me making a very concrete effort to do so to go find them, I didn't even get to see all of them. There's quite a few that I didn't even get to hit. For instance, I didn't ever get to go see the Judd Foundation, which I had always really been meaning to, partially out of time constraint, but this is where I kind of leeway. It also was because it was just in a very strange, or personally I saw it as a strange location for a very infamous art institution to be in. It's because the Judd Foundation actually is smack dab right in the middle of Soho, and if you're not familiar with New York, it's kind of where you go to shop. If you look at where it is located on the maps, it's really funny because it's the Judd Foundation is right across from an Aloe, and it's literally on the same block as the Soho Brandy Melville, which is the infamous one where it's it has a skinny door. Because that was a place that I definitely did try to avoid in my time in New York. It just felt really draining to be there in the first place, so I think I was why is the Judd Foundation 300 feet away from Paloma Wool and Brandy Melville? I was thinking about it deeper, and I think it really is kind of this emblem and a symbol of how much the city and neighborhood New York has changed in itself, which is also very hot topic right now. And it's really interesting because, Judd's own work was really inspired and drawn out of industry-inspired design and form, and Soho in itself used to be where all the factories and industries were, hence why all the artists lived there at the time, because it had cheaper rent and to live there. I just think it's really interesting because it really did used to be the neighborhood where it was so central to manufacturing and the production industry, and you kind of fast forward and look at it now and it's just this recognizable backdrop for fashion girls and their finance boyfriends in New York. But it's not just Soho. You see it in the media all the time recently in conversations about how New York has literally become the spectacle of hyper gentrification at its most fastest and absurd. And just you see this in these areas, you see this constant output of hyper development in terms of luxury condos, hotels, and especially you see a surge in art, galleries opening and spaces for what it means to be a creative. And this goes hand in hand with the age-old debate of why is art always present, or this idea of the creative working class moving into a neighborhood, why is it always parallel to gentrifying a neighborhood? Why is the opening of a gallery always kind of adjacent to the development of cafes or bars that serve $18 cocktails in the neighborhood? But before I get any further into this topic, I did want to do a fun tea review. I've been really into drinking this like chocolate, like wedding tea I got in Paris when I was visiting, and then mixing it with this carrot loose leaf tea from Song Tea in San Francisco. And when you like steep them together, it kind of tastes like carrot cake. I have the taste buds of like a 7-year-old, but it tastes really good. So I think before I go really deeper into like the direct correlation between art and gentrification in terms of space, I really want to touch on first one of my favorite authors in poly-econ, David Harvey, who is a known Marxist geographer, and he's written very extensively and influentially about the production of space under capitalism, and in particular his like what he's really known for is like his theories on uneven geographical development. And to start it off, I really want to draw on one of his most formative texts, Spaces of Neoliberalization Towards a Theory of Uneven Geographical Development. And I think the biggest thing to take away from his text is like he explains when capitalist production faces these periodic crises of over accumulation, this surplus capital that's left over from overaccumulating seeks new outlets. And this isn't usually through further production, but actually more so through investment in the urban built environment where the overaccumulation happens. And in this process that he describes is how gentrification happens and where a neighborhood is transformed. And he says this logic of this imperative of accumulation that exists under capitalism is what, quote, annihilates space to ensure its own reproduction. I really like how he, like, better visualized this structure where he references upon Brodel's model of capitalism as, like, this interlocking three-tiered system where he shows that at the base, which is material life, is where, like, the foundational, non-economic like strata of existence is, where, quote, capitalism thrusts its roots into but can never really penetrate, which can be translated to like art, creative endeavor, like what it means to be actually human regardless of the market. And above this is what lies like the terrain of actual market activity, which is, you know, like directed by supply and demand and price. And at the very top, like of this model, we see the zone of the market where the great predators roam and the law of the jungle operates. And this is where Harvey contends, like at the very top of the model, where the true home of capitalism is, past and present. And I think this model is just really interesting and really great to look at when you're thinking about why art is so correlated with gentrification, is because you look at this, like at the foundational base of it, like natural human endeavor, which what like creative practice, like art is categorized into, lies at the foundation of it. And even though it's not like really considered directly parallel to market activity, actually inherently opposes it, it is still foundational to everything else above it. And this idea of the artist playing the role as a gentrifier has staying power like constantly over these past years because it does carry a lot of truth. Artists do often move into low-income communities of color and bring with them the aesthetics and commodities such as like a $9 matcha or like a Japanese fusion vinyl listening bar. And I read this really interesting, I found this article in Artsy by Peter Moskowitz where he's having this conversation where artists do indeed participate in gentrification, but they can't be blamed for its sole cause. And all of these articles that I've read where it has like this baseline of you can't blame the artist is always referencing, I've noticed this research article by Carl Grodak and Nicole Foster and James Murdoch called Gentrification, Displacement in the Arts. And in this research study, they basically like looked over 30 of America's biggest like metropolitan areas, and their bottom line findings is that fine arts organization and artists generally do not cause gentrification, and the data suggests that rather artists and like art organizations move into the area after gentrification has already started to take place. Peter Moskowitz is basically saying is he's just talking about how, you know, people of color and lower income artists have been living and dwelling in cities even before the term gentrification was coined by sociologist Ruth Glass. And you see in the 50s and 60s, you know, like New York and San Francisco were going through these periods of time as like these pillars of progressive avant-garde art And there wasn't really, like, during this time, there wasn't any noticeable parallel between art's effect on, like, real estate value. But you see, like, as time passes, two things kind of changed that. And one of the things being that different kinds of people started moving into cities, and also the art market started growing tremendously and became way more increasingly professionalized and linked with global finance. Also, another really important historical event was after World War II in the 50s, the US federal government essentially created the suburbs out of thin air by subsidizing the mortgages of millions of Americans. But this wasn't not a very progressive time, and like to be able to have your mortgage subsidized, you usually had to be white, single family, and like very like cookie cutter box model of what it means to live in a home. And this is a time period, you see like the white singular nuclear family with a very largely privatized life in their home in the suburbs like really was at its surge. When the children of, the white flight looked around and decided that they didn't like what they saw, they began moving back to the cities. And in the 70s, New York, San Francisco, and basically every other major urban center began experiencing this influx of this new kind of white person, which was one raised with the aesthetic and economic and spatial value of the suburbs. And basically, like, these pre-gentrified areas in these cities were places where people came to get away from the constricting values of American life. And because like the suburbs produce like this kind of person that brought like a totally different ethic and value system to cities that didn't exist there before. And in the view of a lot of like urban theorists and geographers, they really see this idea of suburbanization, like the mindset of the suburbs unleashing and like having this effect upon cities of bringing like this huge mass like migration of artists who cared more about marketable aesthetics as opposed to actual social change in the way they created art. And this like surge of renowned MFA programs that kind of were seen as like near necessities for success in the art world that kind of became like this determining like structural process of determining who will be allowed into the reward system of the art world, as it is to clown like these Parsons, like Pratt art students, like New York art students for making really bad art and having wealthy parents. In this article, Malkowitz is saying it's really important to note that artists cannot gentrify on their own. While these artists in these crazy MFA programs usually do come from very relatively privileged positions in life, they themselves technically do not have the power to like build condos or like change zoning laws and like give tax breaks to like corporations. And state intervention is like kind of the biggest part and like mechanism to blame in the artist as a gentrifier puzzle. And what he's saying is like you can't blame the individual. Now I'm gonna put this in contrast with another research study by Chiarvalli where she teaches like urban and spatial like studies and development, and she specifically chose to focus on Bushwick in New York in 2017 and why it had become like so emblematic of artistic gentrification. And she goes really further into like the idea of space and like art, like what is coined as art scenes and what exists in these places as like the practice of seeing and being seen, which causes like this aestheticization of everyday life and feeding into the district's image as hip. And she talks really clearly about the symbolic economy of an urban art scene and how it has this tendency to attract like increasingly educated and more sophisticated statuses of consumers. And usually the cultural consumer, people who have more dispensable income are usually wealthier than the cultural producer of the artist stereotype and actually hold like the capital to popularize their taste and lifestyle through different forms of media. And then like as this demographic of the consumer increases, the production in the area becomes secondary to more like remunerative styles of retail and lifestyle and like cafes and like expensive bars. She references Bordeaux, and she says, like, for cultural producers or artists, what they really want is not, like, financialized capital, obviously. What they want is symbolic cultural capital. And what that means is, quote, like, quoting Bordeaux, economic or political capital that is disavowed, misrecognized, and thereby hence legitimate a credit, which under certain conditions and always in the long run guarantees economic profit later down. And, you know, to make it as an artist, the whole point is, like, you have to build prestige for yourself initially, and this doesn't come in terms of profit. It comes in terms of how many people know you and recognize you. So basically what Vali's study is saying, like, yes, artists are, like, this system of how, like, the artist becomes valorized and how the traditional trajectory of an artist's career goes if you are trying to make a sustainable living as an artist actually is to blame for gentrification, and they don't have, like, an empty hand in this. Because artists thus do participate in this feedback loop of where their work and their presence affirm the current cultural cachet of a neighborhood and then accelerates the investment and displacement process of gentrification that might have already been taking place there. But I think what's also interesting to see is, like, this method, like, this process of gentrification has literally become so common and widespread these days that what used to be, like, the artists or, like, the first pioneers of, like, these neighborhoods of, like, pre-gentrified areas are often even no longer needed. But basically cities are skipping, like, the first few phases of what usually entails gentrification and just going straight to top-down development and plunking these brand new luxury condos in, like, abandoned parts of Detroit, Cleveland, New Orleans, and, like, other mid-sized cities in America. And it's so funny to see this other, like, strain of art that has come from this, because I guess, like, the developers realize that in order to attract a consumer, you need to have some form of, like, creative cash to a neighborhood. And often these, like, corporate projects are kind of, like, adorning these aesthetics that do are nostalgic of what normal artist-led gentrification looks like. And this phenomenon is really interestingly termed as corporate plop art. And you see it as, like, this very sterile, decontextualized public artwork that developers commission after the popular struggles over this space have been settled and the area has been determined as gentrified. And unlike participatory, like, community arts initiatives that arise organically out of, you know, maybe raw, sensitive moments in time and transformation, corporate plop art is completely depoliticized, and these developers will hire street artists to decorate new condos with graffiti that is totally devoid of the neighborhood's local meaning and history. And in this sense, this is where you see art really transforming into this tool that is used to attract capital and facilitate displacement and just really become enmeshed in the broader, like, neo-lib agenda of urban commodification. I think another really funny media trend I wanted to touch on was that I've also noticed be lightly ridiculed and kind of very apparent in art workspaces and art industries in, like, urban cities, specifically New York. And it is the trope of, like, the artistic girlfriend and finance boyfriend trope. And I think this conversation topic can go into so many different ways in regards to, like, gender dynamics, like critiquing, like, the heteronormative stereotype of a couple. But this is the concept where the woman, like the female in the relationship, is, like, this creative, super edgy artist type who's, like, a struggling creative, and the guy in the relationship is, like, the money-making, stable, like, steady provider. But I think this, like, binary is actually more of a very reflective symbiosis of, like, how the art world operates, in the sense of, like, the arts having this structural subsidiary of financial capital. And I guess to draw upon, you know, Vali's study again, the finance boyfriend isn't just a partner. What he represents is the world of capital and investment and profit and essentially power. And although the artistic girlfriend is, like, the more expressive, like autonomous type. Her creativity and what she represents as the cultural producer and authenticity that is able to produce cultural labor is what enhances the finance bro. Like, to have her, like, on his arm. It's also rewarding for him, even though it's not specifically in terms of money, but it is in terms of power. And obviously living and working as an artist in New York City is incredibly expensive, nearly impossible. I mean, it is impossible if you don't have a secondary job. It's not incidental, like, it's very deeply embedded in this logic of neoliberalism, which also has effectively kind of trapped the arts in this mindset where the market is natural and inherent, and even the arts need some form of market validation and financial support to survive. And a book that I recently finished reading that I think really helps better understand, like, the deeper problems that are associated with how the arts are funded today. It's very important to turn to this book, Against Charity, by Daniel Reventos and Julie Wark. And in this book, they're basically, like, putting forth this idea that charity, not just charity on itself, but philanthropy as a whole, is very especially relevant to the arts nonprofit world. And this book really critiques, like, the overall system of what it means to be, like, a charity giver or, like, a philanthropist, like, as a whole, but I think it's very relevant to how the nonprofit arts world is very dependent on this idea of, like, the generosity of wealthy donors and corporate philanthropists. I really like this book because I thought it was so interesting. In the beginning of it, it actually starts off with how this concept, like, philosophically, charity has a very complex history in art and the way it's been visually represented. Quote, charity is frequently represented in art as a saintly activity incarnated by people of exalted virtue. And painters like Sardo or Michel Ticini often depict, in these paintings, you see charity being seen as, like, the milk of human kindness, and embodied as a beautiful, usually very voluptuous woman cradling young children. And what's really important to note from, like, the visualization of charity that they go into is that it's never shown as democratic. It's never shown as, like, reciprocal or this act of mutual aid, because charity is always visually portrayed within this framework of power, that there is this divine or earthly authority that governs the relationship between the giver and the receiver. And, you know, you see this very highly reflected in modern philanthropy. Like, if you go to any arts institution, it's like you're bound to run into the name Rockefeller or Mellon. And the way Reventos and Wark describes it is, quote, Carnegie and Rockefeller became, quote, the blonde child of capitalism, and saw being benevolent, financially benevolent, as a tool for preserving an economic class order under the guise of being generous. And the biggest takeaway is that Reventos and Wark really emphasize this idea and critique modern philanthropic systems as not being this reciprocal gift, but a one-way transaction that does nothing but to reinforce the pre-existing inequalities of the system it exists within. They draw really heavily upon Marcel Mauss's theory of the gift exchange and, you know, the Trobrian gift cycle, if you're a fan of cultural anthropology, and they explain that human solidarity should always involve reciprocal relations. But charity, and what it means to be a philanthropist, by contrast, fixes the poor in positions of dependency and obligation to the rich, and perpetuates these social hierarchies instead of actually challenging them or doing anything to fix them. And in the nonprofit arts funding world, like, if you're an arts institution applying or, like, seeking funding, what you essentially need to do is, like, market yourself as an institution or a facet of progress, of representing something regarding change, usually that being, you know, associated with creativity, like social or radical change. And in this other really interesting book I read, I honestly think this is one of the best books I've read this past year. It was really good. Art in the After Culture by Ben Davis. And in this one chapter, he really traces like the history of how arts institutions kind of became like central to becoming these spaces for left-leaning causes starting in the 60s. And in this chapter, he really heavily references Sinead Murphy's powerful metaphor of the art kettle. And this is a term that was borrowed from police tactics. So like during protests, like how like the strategy police officers use to box in and contain protesters. And Murphy uses it to explain how art physically and psychologically contains free thinkers and radicals, and how art is able to regulate our capacity for creativity and imagination and resistance into these very narrow and predictable methods. Like, for instance, a very real example of this was the Ford Foundation, and how, like, these arts foundations that fund the arts have very targeted patronage. And in the 60s, they actually had this very targeted patronage of specifically experimental black theater, of supporting these artists with very genuine radical agendas, but them utilizing it as a way to serve and channel this very existing social conflict into safe and cultural spaces in which the foundation could control. This very, like, tumultuous feeling that this demographic was feeling at the time socially could be translated into something safe and manageable, and they can control what was to come out of it, if that makes sense. They're controlling the modes of cultural expression of it. Which then kind of turns to the very age-old question of then what conditions allow artists and movements to break out of the art kettle. And I think an artist that exemplifies this very well is Hans Hock. For instance, in 1971, he created this piece called Sapolsky Manhattan Real Estate Holdings, a real-time social system. And what it is basically an investigative artwork documenting the real estate empire of a notorious slumlord in New York at the time. And I think this piece very vividly demonstrated like a critique of capital and property practices that were tied to inequality. And, you know, he attempted to exhibit this work at the world-renowned Guggenheim Museum, and the institution refused to show it. Hans actually attempted, I believe it was to show this work, it was at the Whitney. It was either the Whitney or MoMA. I have to fact check this. Because this notorious slumlord actually was on the Guggenheim Museum's board of trustees. But the institution refused to show it because, you know, the censorship was not just an indicator of aesthetic taste. It was very clearly a case of institutional power protecting its own interests, due to the fact that the Guggenheim Board of Trustees at the time had direct financial social connections to the copper industry and very implicit ties to like very shady political dealings, including the US government support for the coup in Chile the previous year. As to go as far, like the museum's curator who supported Hans's work was actually fired. And I think it just really, this example serves to show that our limits to the radicality that arts institutions are willing to show if it goes beyond like simply preserving their social image. And, you know, despite me being here and offering these critiques of these much larger institutional problems, I also am not doubly here to offer some packaged solution to this way larger complex issue. But I also think this, like, it's very easy to fall into the pessimistic response of, like, dwelling upon, like, capitalism is bad and, like, we need to tear it down. I think that is also equally as simplistic and very cliche. And yeah, we live in the structure that is like so fundamentally embedded and self-reinforcing that it can often feel inescapable and really depressing at times. But I think staying in that form of pessimism is kind of very halting and a very angsty paralysis. It's kind of like when you're in high school and you read like Debord or like Sartre's Nausea for the first time, you're like, no, like, this sucks, like, I can't do anything about, like, the system I live in and the environment, and, like, this just sucks, like, everything sucks. And I think instead, even in the face of these systems that, like, seem so immovable, it's very important to acknowledge that there are artists and activists and communities who are experimenting with like building alternatives to this. And one really cool and fascinating example that it was mentioned in 2 books that I recently read over summer. So it was mentioned in this reader that I picked up, REALTY, Beyond the Traditional Blueprints of Art and Gentrification. And also, I think I mentioned this book in my previous video, the Artist Blockchain one, money something. But this organization, the Black Swan DAO nonprofit model in Berlin, was mentioned in both. And what it is this very innovative experiment that uses decentralized funding models and this idea of collective governance to rethink arts funding. And what it is, its name actually heavily draws upon Bitcoin's Nicholas Taleb's concept of the black swan, which is a rare, unpredictable event that basically fundamentally changes everything. And it kind of serves as this opposition, like alternative to the very bureaucratic protocol of how arts funding usually works, in terms of, as if you're an artist, you know, like grant paperwork for each artwork and this very top-down decision-making model. And I'm explaining this in the most, like, general, rudimentary sense possible, so if you want to read more into it, you definitely should. But it's a distributed network of autonomous stakeholders rather than having, like, this centralized organization that decides who gets funding and how it's funded. And it splits participants into 2 different categories. There are the silent users who provide resources, whether that be money or services, and the active users who actually utilize these resources to, like, actually create projects in art. And I guess how they work and operate is really to envision this microgrid of creative support and this ecosystem in which arts communities can self-manage and sustain themselves without the reliance on traditional financial gatekeepers. Also based in Berlin is Haus der Statistik. I'm so sorry, I don't speak German. Or the English translation, House of Statistics. And it's not just any building, it's actually this massive 40,000 square foot modernist complex. And it was actually very famous and played a historical role in GDR management and surveillance, but after the German reunification, it was actually left abandoned for years and slated for demolition until these activists took over and were like, no, we can use this, like, empty building site as, like, an active community and neighborhood for creative production. And initiated by the organization Coop 5, I think it's really pioneering this idea of, like, a truly very cooperative multi-use development, basically hosting affordable housing, a future city hall for Berlin's Mitte district, and an office space for public administration. And it's just the ground floor that is dedicated to spaces of art and culture, social work, and education. And the main thing with the planning and coordination of this, essentially, I don't even know what to call it, like, it's not a neighborhood, but in itself its own self-sustaining ecosystem in the way people live. They are really making sure that the people who establish, like, a space there, the artists, social workers, and cultural practitioners, are not just, like, guests who are, like, they're not just renters, but also very self-supporting stakeholders in the way this space evolves. And since 2019, like, everyone kind of helps cover the operational costs of it, and I'm gonna show the diagrams here, this very intricate system of shared governance of space. I feel like the 2 specific examples I used, I described so roughly, and I skipped over and I did not go into enough detail about, but I know a lot of people have been asking me for, like, a list of readings and papers that I reference in my video essays, and the way my planning process works, it's, like, very chaotic, so I usually do not do this, but I'm trying to be more organized about it now, and as people have asked, I am going to start putting, like, a list of the readings that I reference in all of my videos. So I would really like if you guys found the book or, like, any online articles about either of these projects that actually do go into way more detail about the way they work and function, because in itself I think it's such an interesting read. Also, another thing is these 2 specific examples I used are based in Berlin, and it definitely is important to note that Germany has, like, a completely different form of regulation of their economy, as they're much more like centrally planned ecosystem in terms of how they like govern their economy, and like the US is not like that at all. So there's definitely at odds of how like implementable these projects are universally. And I think the right model in terms of decentralizing or like delinking like the arts funding world from what it traditionally is definitely has to be very responsive to the local conditions and histories of what it's trying to detach from. But these projects that I do reference that are happening and do function and are operational kind of do show that the future of arts funding, or the way the arts, are operational, and this idea of genuine, like, urban cultural life does critically engage with these, like, place-based experiments. And despite how as strong of a foothold, like, financialization and institutional control of development and gentrification and philanthropy does seem, there are these possibilities for reimagining how art and community functions. But I think I would like to keep the end of this video a little bit more open-ended, in terms of if you did make it this far. Oh my god, I think this is the longest video essay I've ever recorded. But just in terms of thinking and self-reflection of your own creative endeavors, or what you think it means to have a personal implication upon the spaces you live in. But with that being said, if you did make it to the end of this video, thank you so much for watching. And like I say at the end of every video, I do hope you took something away from this. I hope you learned. And I think in the future, thank you for my comments, I will be adding a list, like a bibliography of all the books I read, because I really like to share the works of these authors that I'm consuming in my personal time with everyone. So that being said, thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in my next art history lecture.